honorables membres du comité, honorable members of the committee.
I see that we have quorum.
Je dois informer les membres que le président...
I will inform members that the chair has resigned and that we now need to elect a chair. As clerk, all I can do is receive motions proposing nominations. I cannot take part in the debate.
That the chair has resigned and that the clerk of the committee can only receive motions for the election of the chair. The clerk cannot receive other types of motions, cannot entertain points of order, or nor participate in debate. We can now proceed to the election of the chair. Pursuant to the Standing Order 106.2, the chair must be a member of the government. Nous pouvons donc procéder à l'élection de la présidence, conformément à l'article 106.
We can now move to the election of the chair pursuant to Standing Order 106.2. The chair must be a member of the government party.
The chair.
I'll move Iquinder Gahir.
Il est proposé que Iquinder Gahir.
It is moved that Iquinder Gahir be elected chair of the committee.
Other motions? Y a-t-il d'autres motions?
Are there any other motions?
La motion propose.
The motion has been moved by Ms. Jeff O'Connor that Iquinder Gahir be
Gahir be elected as chair of the committee has been received as a notice of motion. Is it the pleasure of the committee to adopt the motion? Plaît-il au comité d'adopter la motion? Je déclare la motion adoptée.
I declare the motion carried. Mr. Gahir is duly elected committee chair.
Mr. Gahir, duly elected chair of the committee. I invite him to come to the chair.
Hi, everyone. I hope the committee resumes as blissfully as my election to chair, but I would like to ask for a brief pause, just so I can consult the clerk as to the next steps. So, suspension, yep. No?
Meeting, the last meeting.
Wow, all right.
To you.
I can start. That's fine. So I call this meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 129, part 2 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Public Safety and National Security. We are resuming our meeting of Thursday, November 7th, 2024. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format. Oh, yeah, okay. Before we begin, I'd like to ask all in-person participants to read the guidelines written on the updated cards on the table. These measures are in place to help prevent audio and feedback incidents and to protect the health and safety of all participants, including the interpreters. You will also notice a QR code on the card on which links to a short awareness video. I'd like to remind participants of the following points. Please wait until I recognize you by name before speaking. All comments should be addressed to the chair. Members, please raise your hand. If you wish to speak, whether participating in Zoom or in person, the clerk and I will manage the speaking order as best we can. So we are going to, I know there is a 106.4 motion that is before us, but we are going to start with resuming debate on the amendment of Mr. McGregor to the motion of Mr. Motts that was moved on November 7th. I recognize Ms. Dancho.
A point of order on a procedural matter, just would like you to confirm, Chair. So the suspension is continuing from the last meeting, and we have that 106.4 as you've outlined. So it is my understanding that once the suspension, let's say those issues are resolved, of the matters in the suspension, that we would and go into the 106.4, which is, of course, of the ISIS terrorist plot to bomb Parliament Hill and a Jewish gathering, which had MPs and others there. Of course, the NDP and us have sent a letter to the chair. Can you just confirm that if the matter at hand is resolved and the Liberals end the filibuster, that we would go into the 106.4 if we deal with that motion first?
So we are going to resume debate on the amendment of Mr. McGregor on the motion that was brought forward by Mr. Motz on November 7th, and then we will move to the 106.4 after that debate. Okay.
Be added to the speaking list, sir.
Sure. So last time when we suspended, Mr. Chahal had the floor, so he will be speaking first, but then Ms. Tancho, you are next. Thank you.
So
Sorry,
you're
point
up
of
to
order,
date?
Chair. Point of order, Chair. My hand.
I recognize Mr. Demoff.
Thank you. My hand was up before Ms. Dancho raised her point of order and asked to speak.
Do you have a point of order?
It's up right now. Oh, I should be next on the speaking order after Mr. Chahal. My hand was up as soon as you took the chair.
So I apologize, Ms. Demoff. I'll keep better track of the screen in front of me. I did see Ms. Dancho's hand first, so I'll list her first on that speaking list.
Except it was up. I mean, I can't help that the clerk or you didn't see it, but I had it up long before she raised her point of order, Chair.
So you can challenge the ruling of the chair, but there's no challenge on the speaking. I've been told by the clerk that there is no challenge to the speaking list, that it is my decision. I apologize that I did not see the screen. There's a chance that your hand was up before Ms. Dancho's, but the list so far is Mr. Chahal resuming, then Ms. Dancho, and then Ms. Demoff, and then Ms. O'Connell.
Okay, thank you.
And then Mr. Wood.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and congratulations, Mr. Gere, to becoming chair of this committee. I guess before I begin, Mr. Clerk, could you just provide maybe a recap? Because we did have a motion that was brought on the floor by Mr. Motz. We had a subsequent, I believe, amendment brought forward by Mr. McGregor, and I see there's a few other members who have joined us today who may have not been present on November 7th when when the meeting was suspended. I think it would be beneficial for all committee members just to have a clear understanding where we are in debate. I have an understanding where we are, but I think for members and just for clarity, so as members have raised their hands, they're able to appropriately debate the amendment that we're on. I'm just wondering if you could provide maybe just a quick update on the original motion brought forward by Mr. Motz and then the amendment that was placed by Mr. McGregor.
Okay, I'm going to read the original motion that once the committee has conducted 8 meetings on the study on Russian interference and disinformation campaigns in Canada, the committee proceeds to the following matters in order. The committee concurrently undertakes alternating meetings of not fewer than 6 meetings each. It's agreed upon study on the rise in the violent crime and a study examining how addressing gaps in community mental health and substance use health supports, including preventative and early intervention services, can improve public safety in Canada. That both the Minister of Public Safety and Minister of Mental Health and Addiction be invited to testify separately for 1 hour each in this study. That the committee report its findings and recommendations to the House, and that pursuant to Standing Order 109, the government table a comprehensive response to the report. 2. The committee invite the Minister of Public Safety and Minister of Immigration to appear before the committee as soon as possible pursuant to the motion passed on September 19th, 2024. And the amendment was on the first part of the motion and should be read that once the committee has conducted both study on Russian interference disinformation campaign and unelectoral interference in criminal activities in Canada by agents of government of India, the committee proceeds to the following matters in order. So that should be, and
Just point of order, sorry.
Yeah, point of
Mr.
order,
Clerk,
Mr. McGregor.
it was concluded, not conducted. That was the key word there. Yeah.
perfect.
Chair, I have a question as well.
Yeah, Ms.
Of
Dow,
clarity.
question?
Yeah, clarity from the clerk. As he was reading that, I heard 6 meetings each, and then Mr. McGregor's motion was when they're concluded. Is the motion that the Russia and India study be 6 meetings each? Is that what's before us? I'm a little confused. Sorry.
The amendment, the original motion was saying that once the committee has conducted 8 meetings, and this part is taken off by the amendment of Mr. McGregor, and the 6 meetings reference is just on the first first part, which is about the committee currently undertakes allotting alternative meetings of not fewer than 6 meetings each. So
Okay.
that's the same 6 meeting in the journal motion.
So his his amendment is for 8 meetings for Russia and 8 meetings for India, or just simply that when they're concluded?
There's no, yeah, it's to take off any reference to a number of meetings.
Okay, thanks.
Mr. Lloyd on a point of order.
I'm wondering, as I believe Mr. Chahal's given up the floor, so shouldn't we move to the next speaker? Mr.
No, he
Chair?
hasn't given up the floor.
I just want to, like, is that, he's given up, there's been 3 speakers since he's given
I
up?
asked-
No, there's been points of order, but Mr. Chahal still has the floor, and I think he's eager to speak, actually.
I am. Thank you, Mr. Chair and Mr. Clerk, for providing this committee a brief update of where we're at. And that's where I'll begin today. I came in on the meeting on November 7th, and it was a very interesting meeting on Russian disinformation that was being studied by this committee. And I understand this committee has a significant amount of work underway. I previously discussed the auto theft report that I know it's also in the queue to be worked upon. And I know that's critical from a piece of work for members in the GTA, but all across Canada, that work, that report be finished, to be reviewed. And so this committee can also submit that to the House of Commons, and important recommendations to deal with this significant issues. I'm somewhat shocked that the Conservatives want to avoid doing that work. But what I'm really shocked upon sitting in this meeting, when I saw my colleague from across, Mr. Motz, bring forward a motion, a programming motion, that tried to delete or get rid of the study on India. I mean, I'm a member of the Sikh community. I'm a proud, born and raised Sikh Canadian. And for me to see this behavior from members across, I was flabbergasted. And that's why I'm here today, that I continue to hear from members, but also have this important debate. Now, we've seen, and I'm glad Mr. McGregor brought in an amendment to reinsert the India study as a priority, as well as the study on Russian disinformation. We saw from our witnesses who provided important testimony that day on November 7th. The one journalist from the Ottawa Citizen and the other individual who represented journalists from across Canada, their concerns on how Conservative members and former Conservative members have targeted them, particularly that individual from the Ottawa Citizen, on his reporting over the years. And so I think that study on Russian disinformation is extremely important. We know that disinformation is conducted through various forms, and I haven't had the opportunity to sit through a number of the meetings and important testimony that's been provided with the Russian disinformation study that this committee has brought forward. But that day, I was alarmed by some of the tactics used with Russian disinformation and the impact on public safety and on national security across Canada. Russian interference and disinformation campaigns that this committee is studying is extremely important that we finish that work, and then we continue on with the work of the study of electoral interference and criminal activities in Canada by agents of the government of India. Now, it's my understanding, and Mr. Clerk, you can advise me if I'm wrong, that we have conducted 2 meetings of that study, and there are several meetings to go. I have had, over the last constituency week, I had the opportunity on Sunday and last Friday. Last Friday was, in the Sikh faith, a very important day. It was the 554th anniversary of the birth of Guru Nanak Dev Ji. And members in the Sikh community, when I was at the Dishmish Cultural Center on Friday, last Friday, raised this important question to me. They said, with what we've seen that's occurred recently with the killing, the murder of Bhai Hardeep Singh Nijjar, what is the government doing? What is Parliament doing? And so I proudly said, as a member of Parliament from Calgary Skyview, that we are conducting a study at the Standing Committee on Public Safety and National Security on this very issue, supported by colleagues. But I also had to tell them that members of the Conservative Party have tried, once again, to avoid having this important conversation. And the question was asked to me, why? Why would they want to avoid having a conversation of public safety issues in Canada, but the targeting of members of our community, Canadians, when a Canadian citizen on Canadian soil at the Surrey Gurdwara was murdered? Think of it. If many of you go to your faith community, a place of worship that's important for you, or maybe where you've gone your whole life to go to religious school or language school with your siblings, with your parents, with your children, with your grandparents, and at that same place, the president of the Sikh Gurdwara was assassinated. What fear does that put into you? What fear does that put into those children? The trauma. Well, the fear that I heard from my constituents and the hundreds of emails I've also received are that we're scared. We're worried with these ongoing threats. We've seen several weeks ago as well with incidents in Brampton, where the Gurdwara in Malton was surrounded with threats of violence. We've seen in the streets of Brampton where there's large protests on this very issue. So I told members of my community in Calgary last Friday, I had the opportunity to speak from the stage at the Dishmish Cultural Center as well. I had the opportunity to participate in an important radiothon that Red FM in Calgary, with the Dishmish Cultural Center, with many communities, an interfaith number of communities coming together at the Gurdwara to raise funds to build a permanent food bank at the Dishmish Cultural Centre. And now that initiative is to ensure that Canadians in our community with concerns of food security have the opportunity to get culturally appropriate food, but to make sure that Calgarians, and in my part of the city, but all Calgarians, have the needs through some of the challenges and difficult times they face to be able to have food for their families. But the biggest concern for those members was Indian interference in our country and the criminal activities that we've seen. We've heard of issues of extortion. We've heard of electoral interference. Journalists have reported that potentially in Conservative Party nomination races, also potentially in the leadership race of the Conservative Party of Canada, that there was electoral interference by foreign governments. And so we need to make sure that we hear from witnesses as we move forward on important testimony from community members of their concerns on our democracy being interfered with. A concern that I'm hearing in a number of, as there are nominations happening for all various parties currently, that there's ongoing potential interference in some Conservative Party races, and that members are concerned that the impact of those will continue unless we have this important discussion and uncover through testimony and bring forward recommendations to protect our democracy and protect this important institution that protects Canadians. So when I heard the important testimony from the members, Mr. Moninder Singh and Balpreet Singh, last week, I also heard from community members last week that they would like to come to speak at this committee, and when could they do so? And I had to alert them once again that this study potentially, if the Conservatives have their way, would not continue because of their avoidance of these public safety concerns in Canada. Now, I do want to go back to what Mr. Balpreet and Moninder Singh, and I did reference this important comments they made last week. One was, it was clearly identified by Mr. Moninder Singh that Conservative members will not ask a question on foreign interference, that their questions continue to focus on duties to warn and avoid directly dealing with the issue at hand. Now, Mr. Moninder Singh brought forward that he had 4 recommendations and concerns, and I think this committee should take these recommendations quite seriously, and I'm hoping to see them in the report. The first was a suspension of security agreements. Now, I believe this committee in 2018 had done a report, potentially, or there was a report on 2018 on the Public Safety Canada, put out a report on terrorism threat to Canada, which had included Sikh Khalistan extremism. And I'm proud that the government at the time, in 2018, took steps to remove the targeting of members of the Sikh community. Members who are in our nation speaking on their beliefs of what a democracy should look like, on their belief of human rights protections, but did not want to be singled out. For many of these community members are advocating for peaceful objection of interference by foreign states. Now, Mr. Maninder Singh provided a second recommendation that he request a public inquiry in the assassination of Bhai Hardeep Singh Nijjar. And that's what I heard as well, that there's a number of community members who are looking for that. And that's why we need to hear from further testimony from witnesses to see if that is something that this committee and our parliament should embark upon. The third recommendation that Mr. Singh brought forward was prosecution of the conspirators, of folks who may have been involved in what's happened here and foreign interference in Canada. Other nations have taken various steps, and maybe we can learn from some of those other countries and how they look to prosecute individuals from foreign nations who have done use similar techniques in targeting their citizens. What can Canada learn? And fourth, anti-Sikh hate. And this is an important issue, and this is what I'm going to actually spend, Mr. Chair, a lot of my time on today. And I will get into the details of the anti-Sikh hate we're seeing and how misinformation and disinformation campaigns and foreign interference has led to anti-Sikh hate across Canada. And I would also say, as a member of the Sikh community, as the member from Calgary Skyview, the anti-Muslim hate that I've seen in my constituency as well. I do have a large community of members of the Punjabi Sikh community and members of the community from the Muslim community, and have an opportunity to proudly represent one of the most diverse ridings in the country. I frequently attend the Gurdwara, but I also frequently attend the masjids in my constituency to hear from community members, and also the mandars. I'm embarking on making sure that we can continue on the harmony we have in our community in Northeast Calgary to bring communities together and not further divide them. Now, before I get into the concerns that our witnesses have on anti-Sikh hate, I do want to talk about what members raised to me last Friday at the Gurdwara Sahib Dashmesh Cultural Centre, last Sunday at the Sikh Society of Calgary in Southwest Calgary, where I attended the Gurpurab. And they talked about the security clearance. That why aren't parliamentarians getting security clearances? Why aren't leaders of political parties getting security clearances? Now, I informed them that all party leaders have or embarked on getting their security clearance so they could see the information provided by our protective agencies, except one. And that's the Conservative Party of Canada, Mr. Pierre Poilievre, who has avoided getting a security clearance. And naturally, folks would say, why? If you want to be a leader of a political party, you want to lead this nation moving forward, why would you avoid getting a security clearance? And I asked them, well, why do you think? Why do you think one would avoid getting a security clearance? Well, they said it's obvious, Mr. MP. It's avoid knowing the truth. So I further probed, and I said, well, what truth? What do you think the member from Carleton, Mr. Poilievre, has to hide? What does he not want to know? Well, it's obvious that there would be information provided by our government security agencies that would implicate members of his party in foreign interference. I probed a bit further. Do you believe there's foreign interference that's occurred in the Conservative Party? And for everybody I asked, they said yes. I found that quite surprising too, that members of my constituency pay such close attention to what's happening. And I'm proud that they're invested in understanding what's happening in our government and in Parliament, that Mr. Poilievre's avoiding getting a security clearance, whereas all other leaders, and they've even acknowledged that other leaders such as Ms. May and Mr. Singh have reviewed that Mr. Blanchette has proceeded in getting his security clearance so he could have the appropriate information to make decisions. And that's what why getting a security clearance is such important. If there's nothing to hide, Mr. Poilievre would get his security clearance. But if he has something to hide or does not want to see the truth, then he would not get his security clearance. Now, getting back to the anti-SECU concerns that I have, before I go there, there's one other item. Mr. Jenis on Wednesday evening of last week, I believe it was November 6th, at this event, the World Sikh Organization provided me this pamphlet of history of the Sikh community and the World Sikh Organization, which I'll reference in today's debate as well. But the member from Sherwood Park, Mr. Jenis, clearly said that the Conservative Party is taking seriously threats to Canadians with foreign interference, that their leader, he read, and there's a transcript if members want to see what he said that day, that the leader will continue to ensure the safety of Canadians, but will take this issue and foreign interference and the threats to Canadians seriously. So why then, if this member has publicly stated, read a letter from Mr. Poilievre, why has the leader avoided getting a security clearance? Why is Mr. Jenis not here today to defend the statement he made that day to the Sikh community? Because he did two things. Either he was put up to read a statement on behalf of his leader that he did not believe. I don't want to use the word because I think that might be unparliamentary to call somebody. I will say that his words, if he read a letter and he believes in it, that he spoke his truth. So I'll take him for his word. But he once again is not here, and if he represents his party and leader and Conservative members across, then they should know that this issue of foreign interference, electoral interference, and criminal activities in Canada by the agents of the government of India is a serious issue, which he agreed with. Now, let's talk about some of the issues and concerns that I want to get to. In 1984, and I know Mr. Singh had raised this that day, Mr. Jenis did not talk about it, for what I recall. What Mr. Singh said that he intended to bring forward to our Parliament on the Sikh genocide that occurred, on the brutal assault on the Sri Darbar Sahib in June of 1984. Now, this is a time in our history of Sikh globally and the Sikh Canadians that every year that members of communities, our community, are re-traumatized, are retaken back when men, women, children were murdered, burned alive, raped because of their faith, for being of the Sikh faith. So every year we commemorate what occurred in 1984 globally, here in Canada, within our communities. Now, at that same time in 1984, Sardar Gyan Singh Sandhu was selected as the first national president of the World Sikh Organization, so they could be a voice for the Sikh community in Canada. And that organization has provided voices for the Sikh community, and they still do today. And that was the event that I had attended, where they've highlighted for over 40 years the important work they've done. And you'll ask me, members will ask me, why does that history have such an important resonate with community members today? Why is that history so important to this discussion today? And I'm going to tell you why. And you really want to pay attention to some of the reference points through history that I'm going to go through and tell members of this community. Well, unfortunately, I mean, this is a part of our history and some of our political parties that we try to forget, or you hope to forget, where some of our party leaders should provide public apologies to, which they have not, under my understanding. If a Conservative member wants to tell me otherwise, I might be wrong, and I'm willing to accept if I am wrong. In 1989, Stephen Harper, who was a former Prime Minister of this nation, was the Reform Party policy chief. Now, he was a failed Reform Party candidate at the time, became the Reform Party chief. And so for folks watching at home or members across do not remember, the Reform Party, well, that is essentially the Conservative Party of Canada today. They merged with the Conservative Party and formed the new Conservative Party of today. At that time, and I have an article here that I'm going to reference. In that same time period in 1990, Baltej Singh Dhillon, and I referenced Mr. Dhillon last day, at our last meeting, wanted to become an RCMP officer. He was accepted into the RCMP, but he faced a choice after being accepted: serve his country or wear his turban. Serve his country like his forefathers have done, fighting for freedom, fighting for the Commonwealth, wearing their turban on the front lines. On Remembrance Day, I had the opportunity to meet with many of our veterans and members also from my community who have proudly served. And so for Mr. Dhillon to be faced with this choice of wearing his turban or serve his country, I can't imagine what he went through. Now, why do I reference this? Well, this particular incident, because the WSO intervened to support Mr. Dhillon and his ability to practice his religion and serve in the RCMP, because we know religious freedom is protected under the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Now, after multiple legal challenges, the Canadian Human Rights Commission and the Supreme Court of Canada upheld Mr. Dhillon's right to practice his faith and serve. So he was a trailblazer for the Sikh community in Canada and for many other members of the Sikh faith who proudly wear their turban in the RCMP but in police services across the country, and I see many proud police officers in the city of Calgary, the Calgary Police Service, proudly wearing their turban and representing their service and keeping Canadians safe in the important and great work they do to protect us, putting their lives at risk every day. But why did Mr. Harper, at that time, as a Reform Party policy chief, embark on an anti-turban crusade of this individual? Well, the Reform Party deemed it unnecessary, allowing the right to wear a turban unnecessary, and went so far to pass a resolution at its 1989 convention banning such religious attire for the RCMP. Now, I did reference at the time Mr. Stephen Harper was the defeated Reform Party candidate and was appointed as the Reform Party's policy chief. And that targeted hate towards this member has led to numerous cases of anti-Sikh hate over the years. Now, and you'll say, well, what numerous cases? Well, I can tell you. Conservative MP Bobby Sparrow brought forward a petition and protests in the city of Calgary, my city. I remember that as a child, this issue in Calgary, where one, you have the Reform Party, two, you have the Conservative Party, and this member, an elected member of the House of Commons, bringing forward, endorsing a petition, rallying community members so we don't allow members of the Sikh community to participate, to work, to provide for their families, to serve our country. A petition against, an anti-Sikh petition against. Now that petition, with the Reform Party's 1989 decision, caused a significant amount of hate during that time to members of the Sikh community. Now that's when the rhetoric began. I think this committee should continue to study this, because those were the seeds of hate, and I'm not saying that's the start of that hate, but those are clear instances where leaders of political parties, members of parliament, aspiring political leaders engaged in targeted hate towards Sikhs in Canada. Now, Mr. Poilievre, one would ask, what was his role? I think that's something that we should uncover. Was he a member of the Reform Party of Canada at the time? Yes, he was. It's my understanding he was. What was his role? Was he a young reformer? He was. I think it's in his bio. Maybe if Conservative members want to tell me that I'm wrong, I'm willing to hear their debate. They can engage if he's made comments denouncing Mr. Harper or the actions of the Reform Conservative movement in targeting Sikh community members. I've never seen Mr. Poilievre make any apologies to his role, or Mr. Harper make any apologies in his role in targeting the Sikh community. But what was Mr. Poilievre's role in 1989? Was he a youth leader in the Reform movement? Oh, he was. He was a University of Calgary proud reformer. I remember seeing him. Also with Mr. MP Shiv Majumdar, rallying the reformers on their populist crusade targeting immigrants. I remember. I was a student at the University of Calgary in the early 1990s. I remember. Their advocacy promoted me to step forward as well, to fight racism and hate in this country. So you're wondering where I'm going with this. I know members across the table are. I can tell you where I'm going. When Mr. Harper became leader of the Conservative Party of Canada, he went back to the old playbook. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, it was targeting the Sikh community. Well, he found a new target in the elections that came forward. Now, I'm going to reference to members what I'm exactly referring to. There's an article in the paper that beware Stephen Harper's crusade against unfamiliar clothing. Now, you might ask me, what was that about? That's an article from 2015. He targeted the Muslim community. Members may recall that Mr. Harper brought forward in was it the 2015 election? Well, let's see. He targeted Muslim women in Canada in 2015 with this niqab ban. So he labeled and targeted all Muslim women with a niqab ban. Now, as a member of the Sikh community, I recall that in 2015. The first thing I thought was this is Mr. Harper's attempt to resurrect his campaign of anti-Sikh hate, now has moved on to target the Muslim community. I know many members of the Muslim community. I see my colleague sitting next to me, MP Zahed, who proudly wears a hijab. And I thank her for doing so,
Point of order.
practicing her faith.
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Sorry, I recognize Mr. Lloyd.
I'll just be very quick. Mr. Chahal asked, what Mr. Polyev was doing in 1989, and Mr. Polyev was a 10-year-old.
So that's not a point
That's
of order.
was a
debate.
That's a point
10-year-old
of
in
debate.
1989. So I'm just clarifying for him. He asked a question. Mr. Polyev was 10 years old at the time.
That's not a point of order. So, Mr. Chahal?
Well, I'm glad. I'm glad Mr. Lloyd has brought that important information forward, which is not a point of order, a point of debate. I'd hope he would continue to debate that when he gets the time of when he gets the floor. I would let Mr. Lloyd know that when Mr. Polyev was at university, he was involved in the Reform Party, which I did reference clearly. Mr. Harper, in 1989, you may want to reference how old he was in 1989 and confirm when you do have the floor, Mr. Lloyd, of his role on targeting the Sikh community by bringing this motion forward. That's a question I ask you to note and to clearly take responsibility now for Mr. Harper's actions and Mr. Polyev's silence on this issue. I'm waiting for an apology as a member of the Sikh community, as a Canadian, from Mr. Harper and leaders of the Conservative Party. I could move forward if they gave a sincere apology to Mr. Tildon and to members of the Sikh community for their actions of that day. He may have been misinformed. He was misinformed. He may have been misguided. But politically motivated attack to win a few extra votes at the expense of targeting Sikh community members, 2015 targeting Muslim community members, that's something we need to continue to think about as we move forward. Now, how does that tie into anti-Sikh hate? Well, I talked about the 40 years since 1984. I've talked about incidents, particular incidents over the years that contribute to hate towards community members. But continued misinformation and disinformation campaigns, as this committee has been studying, targets, influences Canadians across this country. It also brings out the bots, the global bots from various nations, whether it's, I don't know if they're real or not, but those bots are real because they flood our social media accounts with misinformation and disinformation, calling people terrorists, calling people hate mongers, calling people lots of things that are very inappropriate. But that's a tactic that's used. That is a tactic that's been identified, I believe, in this study of Russian disinformation. It might be a tactic used in the study that we're studying right now. Now, I'm not pointing fingers to any, with the government, members of the government of India. I don't know. But we do need to study this to see what's actually happening. Now, I had the opportunity over a number of years to travel to India, and I did not see, in my travels, I saw peace and harmony amongst members of our community. When I traveled to India, people treated me with lots of kindness, love, and respect. As I went to the ashram in Delhi, a beautiful place. If you have not gone, it's a place you may want to visit in the heart of Delhi. And I'm proud that members of my community here recommended I go there to get insights on the history, but learn more about the Hindu religion. So I went and I spent a number of hours and had a lovely meal with community members there. I went to the Jama Masjid in New Delhi, a very special place in the heart of Delhi with beautiful views over the skylines of New Delhi, and seeing many worshippers come to see a historic site from hundreds of years in the city of Delhi, in the old city of Delhi, but to see worshippers from the Muslim community come and worship. And of course, as a member of the Sikh community, I went to the Golden Temple. Now, when I did go to the Golden Temple, members of the community did raise concerns with me, legitimate concerns of making sure that I do my duty in Canada as a parliamentarian to bring forward important issues that affect the Sikh faith, but not just the Sikh faith, of all faiths, having the ability to practice through religion, their language that's so important to protect, but their faith and religion in countries abroad without fear. And that's something I heard from whether I was at the Hindu Mandir, at the ashram in New Delhi, or I was at the masjid in Delhi, or whether I was at the Golden Temple, the Harmandir Sahib. But when I was there, I saw remnants of the targeted attack on the Golden Temple. And so that brought forward some memories for me, because I did go in the early 1980s as a child to India and Pakistan. I went to Nankana Sahib in Pakistan. I had the opportunity to go to the beautiful city of Lahore. Folks may not know the city of Lahore is the traditional capital of Punjab. Before Punjab was partitioned by the British, Lahore has been the cultural and traditional capital of Punjab historically. Now, that long history, if you want a real understanding of how we got to where we are today, we need to understand how our nations were formed. When India's democracy, which is the world's largest democracy, was formed, how Pakistan was formed, and the trauma that occurred for members on both sides of this border that the British drew across that land. Now, many of that history brings us forward into the challenges we face today, because we do need to understand that history. But I'm not looking to do a study on history of India and Pakistan. It might be an important study to have at the Foreign Affairs Committee. So maybe something me and my colleague MP Zaid can think about and work on. But I think we do need to study this study that the Conservatives are avoiding. Electoral interference in criminal activities in Canada by the agents of the government of India. Was there interference? If so, where? Who was involved? How were community members targeted? Are they still being targeted? I hope not. When I saw Bhai Hardeep Singh Nijjar get murdered, I was hoping, really hoping that this was not what I thought it was going to be, and that other members of the community also wouldn't be targeted and attacked. But unfortunately, the RCMP has brought forward evidence to show this was a targeted attack. Now, members of the community feel unsafe. Members of the Sikh community, members of the Muslim community, members of the Hindu community, members of the Christian community, of all these faith groups are concerned if they have ties to India. Should they be concerned? Yes, they should be concerned, because we've seen an individual get murdered. Should they be concerned moving forward? Well, if we don't continue this study, we won't know. We won't know. We are on meeting 2 of a study that the Conservatives are trying to avoid. I have a Conservative member heckling me, but the truth of the matter is Conservatives brought forward a motion that deleted India in all future studies. Now, if that motion had India included as the main focus of the first study that we finished with Russian disinformation, I thought I could say, you know what, they want to make a longer-term plan of programming this committee. But that wasn't the intent. You can't pull the wool over the eyes of Canadians as much as you want to try to do so. The intent was to deliberately avoid studying this issue because Conservative Party politicians are involved in electoral interference by foreign governments or government. In this case, it's government, what witnesses have said. Could it be governments? I don't know if Conservative members, well, I mean,
So we're gonna. So Mr. Chahal has the floor.
I guarantee my heckling
there's
will be
disorder
far
here.
worse than yours.
Order. It's my first order. So we're gonna stop the crosstalk and we're gonna let Mr. Chahal speak because he does have his floor. Thank you.
So, well, of course I'm expected to be heckled from members across the floor for speaking the truth here. I was told to be careful. What should I be careful of? Sounds like a threat. You know what? I've been threatened my whole life by folks. I'm not going to back down from a threat. What I am going to do is I'm just stating here what our 2 witnesses stated at the one meeting that I attended. We have another 4 meetings, and I don't even know if 4 meetings will get to where we're going, but I want to get to 4 at least. I do appreciate Mr. McGregor for realizing that the Conservative motion was complete avoidance of studying India and bringing forward an amendment, which we're discussing right now. And I think that's what we need to do. I don't think this committee should be programming a motion when we have the study of Russian interference and disinformation, the study of electoral interference, which is on meeting 2, and the criminal activities of agents of the government of India underway, with the important auto theft study that we have also that needs to be completed. So I would ask colleagues, as I will take time to further reflect on this amendment, but on the amendments that may be brought forward, what are some proposed amendments that I would personally, without talking to my colleagues across the floor, I'd love to collaboratively have a moment to speak with them to see if they're actually interested in moving the important work of this committee forward. On what amendments could I support? Now, 6 meetings, I think that's what we need to focus on. Could it be 8? Possibly, but I think we need to do our 6 before we think about maybe future meetings. That's what I'm thinking. Now, I am open to other opportunities to hear from members in their debate on whether they believe, and I hope it's Conservative members who will provide a rationale and why I believe that excluding India was important for them in their motion, because that is what we're studying here today. Will they provide that rationale, or will they go down a different path? I don't know. But as I conclude my remarks in a few minutes here, this is an issue of accountability and transparency that members of the Conservative Party so often talk about in election campaigns. We stand for accountability. We stand for transparency. The public should know. The public should know. Where's the accountability? When this committee had an approved motion which members agreed upon, where's the transparency to the public? Where's the honesty? I don't see their leader showing or displaying any of those, and I'm referring to Mr. Poilievre, because he has not got a security clearance. We are accountable to the electorate. I will be looking forward to going to the next election, standing and fighting on this issue and many others that are important to my community. I look forward to the Conservative Party candidates who are going to run against me if one ever gets nominated, or if their leader appoints somebody, which probably is what will happen, because that's their belief in democracy and picking and choosing who the candidates are across the country to avoid nomination battles because of interference. I don't know. What are they worried about? Having a nomination meeting where people can debate issues publicly, on the important foreign policy issues, on important domestic issues? Oh, but Conservatives never show up to debates as well. Yes, I remember that. In my last campaign, we had several debates, and the Conservative Party member opposite never showed up to a debate. I would love to debate in my riding my next opponent. I've also challenged certain Conservative Party members to run against me if they believe that I'm not worthy of being the elected representative of the future Calgary McKnight. Haven't heard from that member yet. I'm also saying to members that I'm looking for competition. I thrive on it. I'm used to hearing from Conservative members talk a big game, but I'm also looking for one to take the nomination and run against me in a public, open nomination fight that they will have in their own party. That's democracy. handpicking a candidate to run against someone, which we've seen in a number of ridings, or disqualifying candidates for having a difference of opinion. Whoa. That's not democracy. So I want to thank members of this committee for, I know I did take a little bit of time last meeting and taken a bit of time this meeting as well. So I have a few minutes to maybe collect my thoughts, and I do have a lot more to say, Mr. Chair, and I thank you for taking the time and listening. I know, as you're a member of the Sikh community, you will understand the deep concerns that I have and the concerns of communities that we represent have across Canada. And I just hope, I really hope that the Indian government takes action within their own country, in their own judicial system, take actions against members of their country who have been involved in any sort of interference in Canada, so we can bring justice to the families who have lost loved ones over, whether it's from the Sikh genocide in 1984, but for the family of Bhai Hardeep Singh Nijjar, who's asking for justice, that they take action according to their democracy, but we as parliamentarians take the appropriate actions at this committee and in Parliament to ensure that we are continuing to protect Canadians and bring forward recommendations through the work of this study to bring improvements so Canadians of all faiths, of all communities in this great nation of Canada feel safe. That can only be done if we go through these important studies that we are studying. I look forward to supporting potentially the amendment, but I am going to reflect on some of the issues the clerk raised when he read out the original motion that Conservative members brought to exclude India in the study, and Mr. McGregor brought the amendment back in to include it. I think I do have some further reflections, and Mr. Chair, I think I will want to be put back on the speaking order at some point, but I will reflect in the meantime and collect my thoughts to engage in further debate. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and congratulations to you on your first day of chair of this committee, and I look forward to working with you and committee members as we move forward. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chahal, for your remarks. Next on the speaking order is Ms. Dancho. Ms. Dancho.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and congratulations to you on your first day as chair of this committee. It's certainly a significant role, and we wish you the best of luck. And also, on behalf of Conservative members, we wish Mr. McKinnon very well in his next chapter and appreciate his efforts on this committee. Certainly, I'm glad to speak to our Conservative motion. We haven't had the opportunity to put any words on the record for really, I think, since we first moved it. So I appreciate being able to speak, Mr. Chair. And certainly I worked diligently to craft that motion with my colleagues. And certainly, Mr. Chair, you would have heard before you were in the chair role that Conservatives have had concerns that we don't have a schedule in this committee. Now, previous iterations of this committee have had agreed upon schedule where we ensure that motions are debated and then we agree on what we're going to study and in what order. We've had a situation at this committee that's been noted by a number of different parties that there hasn't been consistency or any. We don't know what, for example, we don't officially know what we're studying on Thursday or next Tuesday or the Thursday after. So that has been in discussion for a number of weeks, and we've been asking the chair, the former chair of this committee, to bring forward a calendar of events to anticipate of things that we've already passed. That was not done. So our thought process on this motion was to put forward sort of an order that we can agree to as a committee and have that debate to formalize what we're going to study. So as you'll recall, Mr. Chair, all parties agreed to study the India study for a minimum of 6 meetings. And the Russia study did not have any number of meetings, which is a bit unusual. It's not unprecedented, but it's a bit unusual, certainly in my experience, to have a study with no agreed upon number of meetings. It's odd, and it doesn't allow us to make any definitive plans for future studies or issues. And so putting together the motion in its original form, the aim was certainly to put a number of meetings on the Russia study, which was 8. We thought that that made sense. That's a pretty standard, respectable, long study. And since we'd agreed to 6 on India, and I know the Liberals wanted to bring back the social media platforms, they also wanted to summon, or we did as a committee, in fact, a number of other witnesses that refused to come willingly on the Russia study. For us, that was, okay, that's 2 more meetings, fair enough. And on India, we'd had two studies or 2 meetings already, meaning we would have 4 left. So because we'd agreed to a number of meetings on India, we didn't feel that it was necessary to include it because we'd already agreed to 6 meetings. Russia was specifically mentioned so that we can put a number on how long we want that study to be. Again, 8 seems very reasonable. The India one was 6. That seems reasonable. Those are lengthy, robust studies. And so that was the objective, first and foremost, of the first paragraph in the original motion. I had showed that original motion to my NDP and Bloc colleagues, and we'd had a good discussion about that, and it was verbally implied and explicitly talked about that, of course, we'd finish India, and the 6 we had agreed, and we'll do 8 on Russia. And so I do appreciate Mr. McGregor moving an amendment just to clarify on the India study. That has been a very robust study. I really appreciate the opportunity to hear from the CSIS Director, the National Security Advisor, and others. And we look forward to doing those 6 meetings as agreed upon. If we want more, then of course we can do that. But it certainly was not left out as a purposeful maneuver of some kind. It's just we'd already agreed to 6, so it didn't need to be explicitly in the motion, but Russia did not have an agreed upon number of meetings, so we suggested 8. And then, of course, we had agreed as a committee, the NDP had brought forward a motion, in essence, about mental health and the impact of substance abuse and other things. We agree that's obviously a very important issue. There's been 40,000 people killed in Canada because of that, and it's really causing a lot of chaos and mayhem and crime and really a lot of pain in vulnerable communities and to other innocent people in our cities and elsewhere. So we agree very much we should study that. He hadn't formally moved that motion, but he had put it on notice a number of weeks ago. And we do think that's something we can all agree to study as a committee. And so we really did, the NDP wanted to move it for him because we know it was important to him. And then, of course, the other motion mentioned in there to be included was the study that I had brought forward to review and bring in expert testimony on violence against women and children, including sexual violence. And of note, I'm sure everyone in this committee is aware, we all read the news, but just a few weeks ago, a mother was murdered in front of her kids in broad daylight in a park not too far from here in Ottawa, presumably by her intimate partner who just jumped out of a car, stabbed her repeatedly, and slit her throat in front of her kids. Unfortunately, there's a lot of that going on in this country, and in fact, certain jurisdictions, and Ontario specifically, have declared femicide sort of at a crisis level. I think it's like one woman is murdered every 2 days in Canada, and in some areas it's even more. So obviously that's a critical issue of public safety. We need to hear from police services across the country and others involved in that violence and how to prevent it and how to deal with the perpetrators and ensure justice is brought to them. So that was, in essence, that was the thought process behind this, Mr. Chair. It was an effort to bring forward a schedule, a recognition that we have agreed as a committee to study India for at least 6 meetings. We had not agreed on a number of meetings for Russia, so we proposed 8, and a number of other issues. Oh, and the last one, my apologies, I forgot. The last part of that amendment was to bring back the Ministers of Public Safety and Immigration, which again, we'd agreed to as a committee, to answer on their investigation of those father-son duo who had come in through the immigration stream and were planning to do a terrorist attack in Toronto. Many have had concerns that it was on the Jewish community, and then as well as the Pakistani gentleman on a student visa here in Canada that was on his way to Brooklyn, New York, to murder Jews on October 7th, first anniversary. We agreed again as a committee to a lot of the things in this motion. So again, just the objective of this, and I wrote it. So unless other members want to call me a liar, which I welcome them to do, be happy to address that. The objective was, in essence, to set a calendar. So again, we welcome debate on that and committing priorities and what have you, but certainly Conservatives have agreed to the India study, we've agreed to the Russia study, I've learned a lot in those studies. I also have many members from particularly the SECU community in my riding. I've consulted at length with them. I am very aware of how critical this issue is in that community, and frankly to all Canadians. The idea that a foreign government is looking to murder people on Canadian soil is just such an affront to our safety as Canadians, but also our sovereignty. We've all put words on the record on that to suggest that we don't want to study India is just patently false. And there's a lot that's been said that I don't think really needs to be addressed, but that's from the Liberals, but that's certainly our intentions with this motion. We hope that we can get it a real calendar together so we can actually have a functioning committee. And I will say that it's been over a meeting and a half, in essence, Mr. Chair, that all of our work has, in essence, been stopped because of this filibuster. So I just find it odd that when an argument is being made about we need to study this issue, we need to study that issue, but there's a filibuster going on from those making that claim, it just doesn't really hold water, Mr. Chair, obviously. Like if we have to, if they want to study, let's get to work. That's what we're trying to do. We very much support Mr. McGregor's amendment in that regard. I would also say that you are aware, Mr. Chair, that we had put forward a letter, a 1064 letter, because it was recently just revealed in the news, shocking that we didn't learn about this sooner, that just under a year ago there was an ISIS plot to bomb Parliament Hill.
Point of order, Chair.
Particularly a Jewish, pardon me.
Chair.
Order. Ms. Damoff on a point of order.
Thank you, Chair. The 1064 has nothing to do with the debate that we're having right now.
So
I'll get to the point of why I mentioned it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Again, if I'll just be able to finish what I was saying, and the reason that I'm talking about the 1064 is, again, to make the point that we're not able to discuss any other issue at this committee if there's a filibuster going on. And there are important issues. And again, one of those is the news that there was a bombing plot on Parliament Hill. The leader of the Conservative Party was there. Our deputy leader was there. There were two Liberal members of Parliament. In fact, the former Minister of Public Safety was at that gathering, and a whole host of other innocent Canadians, particularly from the Jewish community, was there. It is shocking that it took parliamentarians 10 months to learn about what happened there. Why weren't we informed sooner? So with that, Mr. Chair, I would like to move a sub-amendment to the motion regarding this issue. So again, if we look at the motion as proposed amended by the member from the NDP, I'll just read it out and then I'll read in the sub-amendment, Mr. Clerk, if that works, and we'll ensure that everybody has a copy of that as well. So if the amendment from Mr. McGregor passes, the motion reads as follows: that once the committee has concluded both the study on Russian interference and disinformation campaigns in Canada, the committee proceed to the following matters in order, and its study on electoral interference and criminal activities in India by agents of the Government of India. The committee proceed to the following matters in order. And this is where the sub-amendment would come in, Mr. Chair. So number one would be added, new number one. It would read as follows. Given that recent court filings have revealed disturbing details about a thwarted ISIS-linked bomb plot targeting Jewish Canadians on Parliament Hill, and given that hate crimes have increased 251% over the past 9 years, the committee immediately prioritized a study to investigate the dramatic rise in terrorist plots and acts of violence targeting Canada's Jewish community, including the thwarted terror attack on Parliament Hill, that the study be comprised of no less than 6 meetings, that the Minister of Public Safety, the Special Advisor on Jewish Community Relations and Anti-Semitism to the Prime Minister, the RCMP Commissioner, the Director of the Parliamentary Protective Service, the Director of CSIS and other law enforcement officials, and the civil society and academic organizations, including the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs and B'nai B'rith, be invited to testify as part of this study, and that the committee report its findings and recommendations to the House. So the purpose of moving this sub-amendment, Mr. Chair...
Sorry, point of order.
Yeah. Mr. Connell, on a point of order.
I would question if that is actually a sub-amendment. It is a completely different motion or topic in dealing with the motion itself. It is not in any part of the topic. There was no notice, so I would argue that is not a sub-amendment.
So just before that, Ms. Dancho, the clerk informs me that because you're in debate, you actually can't bring this motion forward.
I believe I can bring forward a sub-amendment to an amendment. But if I may just respond, as I've outlined, as the writer of the original motion, as I've just outlined, perhaps others weren't listening, the purpose of the original motion is to set a schedule for this committee with its priorities. This is a priority for the Conservative Party. If it's not a priority for the Liberal Party, I welcome them putting that on the record. It certainly seems so, given they've been filibustering and trying to avoid the 1064 about the potential, the idea that there was almost a bombing on Parliament Hill, the Leader of the Opposition, many Jewish Canadians and others. This is a series of thwarted terrorist attacks on the Jewish community, Mr. Chair.
Point of order.
Ms. Damoff, on a point of order.
Yeah, I question, we keep going back to the contents of the 1064 and an amendment that is not it's not a sub-amendment. We're currently debating adding the India study. This is not a sub-amendment to that sub-amendment that we have. So I really question the validity of this amendment that Ms. Dancho is speaking to.
If I may respond.
Point of order.
Mr. Gerritsen, on a point of order.
I think that Ms. Damoff is correct. What Ms. Dancho should be doing is moving this amendment after the existing sub-amendment is voted on. The existing amendment is voted on. Because this is not attempting to amend the amendment that's currently being debated. As a matter of fact, that stays in its existing form.
So thank you to Ms. Damoff and Mr. Gerritsen. I do tend to agree, and so does the clerk, that the sub-amendment has to deal with the contours of the motion and the amendment itself. When it goes outside that bounds, and it's not out of it's out of order. Sure.
Didn't mean to cut you off. I just wanted to respond. I would say again, the purpose, in my understanding, from the NDP amendment is
Point of order, Chair.
You've ruled. There's no debate on your ruling unless she'd like to challenge you.
I believe I have the floor. I didn't give up the floor, Mr. Chair.
A point of order. The chair has made a ruling that this amendment is out of order.
Then you don't get to talk.
Then there's no debating that.
So
Mr. Chair, I
Ms.
believe I
Dancho still
have
has
the
the floor.
floor.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Okay, so again, and I appreciate that you've ruled. So are you officially ruling this out of order?
It's out of order, but you still have the floor.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So again, the purpose of moving the sub-amendment to Mr. McGregor's amendment.
Point of order.
Ms. O'Connell, on a point of order first.
I recognize what Ms. Dancho is trying to do, but she can't speak to a sub-amendment that's been ruled out of order. She can get back to the amendment, which is the topic we're on, and she would still have the floor.
If I can get a sentence out, I believe I can make my point, Mr. Chair.
It is my turn.
Go ahead.
I was recognized by the chair.
I think you started
She
the
can't
heckling,
speak
so-
to a sub-amendment that was
Again, if I
ruled out of
continue to get
order.
cut off,
She
Mr.
can go
Chair.
back to the amendment that we are debating. That's how the rules
believe I
work.
have the floor.
I get that she wants them rewritten for herself when they're not convenient, but that is how the rules work.
Ms. Damoff, you'd also ask for a point of order?
Two things, actually, Chair. It is so disrespectful to the interpreters when Ms. Dancho is talking over Ms. O'Connell. We can't possibly expect our interpreters to be able to make any sense of what's being said. And given the injuries that interpreters have had, I would hope that all members would be respectful and wait to be recognized by the chair. My point of order was the same as Ms. O'Connell's, Chair, that you've ruled on the amendment that Ms. Dancho wanted to speak to. If she wants to speak to the amendment that Mr. that Mr. McGregor has brought forward. She still has the floor, but she can't keep returning to the amendment that she wants to speak to unless she wants to challenge your decision, Chair.
Great, thank you, Ms. Damoff. I do agree. We know that there's been incidents with the interpreters with crosstalk, so I would ask all members to respect the interpreters and all the great work that they do and not engage in crosstalk. If you're recognized by the chair, then you can speak. Ms. Dancho, you have the floor, but again, I ask you that this sub-amendment was out of order and to perhaps return back to what we're discussing on the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think if I was allowed to speak more than a few words that being cut off by Liberal members who are trying to silence members of the opposition, I would be able to make my point. And I would remind you, Mr. Chair, that it was Liberal members over the past year that caused such disarray. In fact, it was Ms. O'Connell that caused such disarray that the chair had to adjourn the meeting. I can't imagine the impact that that had on the interpreters, given how unprofessional the conduct was by Liberal members that day. So on the amendment from Mr. McGregor, again, the motion here is to try to have a schedule, Mr. Chair. That is the point of bringing this forward. That is why I brought, Mr. Motz brought this forward. And then the NDP's amendment is to further clarify that schedule. We agree with their amendment, in fact. And so, again, I think Liberal members or NDP members or Conservative or Bloc, if there are other things they'd like added to the schedule, which, again, is the objective of this motion, Mr. Chair, is to create a schedule for this committee of some kind, then they're welcome to do so. And that's why I tried to bring in the latest issue that I just was talking about. And I think it's quite shocking, actually, that Liberal members don't want to talk about a bomb threat brought by ISIS terrorists on Parliament Hill. I've actually did not anticipate that. I thought that this would be roundly supported.
Point of order, Chair.
Ms. Damoff, on a point of order.
We keep returning to an amendment that's been ruled out of order. This was not Liberals voting down an amendment. I think we need to be clear that Ms. Dancho keeps returning to this amendment that's been ruled out of order and is now putting misinformation out there about us not supporting it, which is not part of the record.
Mr. Garrison, on a point of order.
Yeah, I just, for your benefit, Mr. Chair, just want to make sure that it is understood where we are right now. We are on an amendment to the original motion. The problem with Ms. Dancho's rationale as to why she was proposing it and wanted to put it forward is it is premised on the notion that the amendment will pass. And that's why you can't bring forward a sub-amendment that assumes that the amendment passes when it's not related to
Great.
it. So I don't think that there's anything wrong with what she's bringing forward. It's just not at the right time.
Thank you, Mr. Garrison. So I've made the point already that, I asked Ms. Dancho to stay within the confines of the motion itself. I understand this is more of a scheduling motion. As the new clerk, I just want to say at the outset that as the new clerk, I hope to, what do they say? Clerk. As the new chair, I'll get used to this. I'll get used to this. As the new chair, I will see the lay of the land, and I'll work with the clerk to present potentially some sort of an outlook of what meetings we're going to have. When I look at the meetings on Russia and India, these are obviously very dynamic and robust topics, and I think that's why it was built into the motions that we can seek further meetings, depending on what witnesses say and depending on how the committee feels about those. So, Ms. Dancho, you still have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate that. Thank you for committing to attempt to bring forward a calendar. We very much hope to have a chair who resumes that practice. It was quite helpful and actually ensured that we were an efficient committee who really got into a lot of issues. So again, we support the motion, and we really have no reason to put additional remarks on the floor. We've addressed why this motion was brought forward. That's why we support the amendment from the NDP, because in our minds it was implied we were going to continue India. We already agreed to 6 meetings, but we appreciate the clarification, which is why we agree with Mr. McGregor's amendment. So we're happy to proceed. Now again, unless there are more efforts to filibuster this from Liberal members, unless they're saying they don't agree with this motion, then I think I hope that we can go to a vote and we can set this schedule, and then we can get to the reason for today's meeting, which is the 1064, as you well know, Mr. Chair. So certainly, Mr. Chair, I do hope that we can come as to an agreement on this motion. It was certainly framed. I've certainly seen far more partisan motions in my life. It was an effort to get everybody to agree to something. So certainly I hope that we can do that very much. And hopefully we can finish the Bloc Québécois study, because that was an excellent study and it's certainly an important issue. And I recognize this sort of derailed a little bit of time that we would have had. I think we'll need a little bit more time than was scheduled, but hopefully we can get a study across the finish line. That would be great. Anyway, I will just conclude my remarks, Mr. Chair, and I do hope that we can come together and agree on a plan forward. That's certainly the object or the goal that we had in mind here, and we hope we can proceed to that goal and vote soon, hopefully. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Sancho. Ms. Damoff is next on the speaking order.
Thank you, Chair. And I'm actually happy to weigh in on this, having just spent last week in Poland, Estonia, and Latvia on a parliamentary delegation led by Conservative Senator Senator Wells. And you know, it's pertinent to what we're talking about today, because I was really disheartened that the Conservatives wanted to limit the study on Russia and have twice brought forward motions when we were doing this study that interrupted expert witnesses that we had in front of us. One of the things that struck me when I was there was how seriously people in those countries take Russian interference and Russian misinformation and disinformation far more seriously than we do, even though as a country who's an Arctic nation, that we are at threat by Russia. We are at threat by the way that they conduct misinformation and disinformation. It's something that's far more extensive than what we've heard thus far at committee. And I left that trip, to be very honest with you, which focused primarily on what's going on in Ukraine and the fight that Ukrainians are putting on. And we heard from Janis Sarts, who's director of the NATO Strategic Communications Center of Excellence. And he talked to us about what they called cognitive warfare. So right now in Europe and in Canada and the United States, Russia is conducting cognitive warfare against us. They've been at it for 10 years, over 10 years. What I found disturbing was the fact that they told us that China is starting to piggyback on that Russian interference, that the Russian strategy is to target the West, that China is not nearly as capable as Russia is. But what they do is they push the Russian narrative. They push the Russian narrative primarily on TikTok and Telegram. And what we heard about TikTok was quite disturbing. And it was in the context of Russian misinformation and disinformation, and how China is using TikTok to amplify what Russia is putting out there. That TikTok has the best targeting algorithm of all the social media companies. And to be honest, that's why I'm looking forward to having TikTok return to the committee to talk to us and be able to ask them questions about this algorithm. What we heard what I heard and the delegation heard is that pre-bunking is far more effective. And I think, as I listened to the Conservative member talk about, programming and how important doing a study on gender-based violence, I couldn't agree with her more. It is really important to study that. And I know the committee has agreed to it, but, I think the public needs to know that is being studied right now at the Status of Women Committee. We are hearing from witnesses. Just this week, we'll be hearing from more witnesses on that exact issue. So it's not that the issue is going unattended to. And I feel strongly that we need to be looking at not limiting that Russia study to 8 meetings, which is what the Conservatives did when they brought forward their motion. And I appreciate my friend and colleague, Mr. McGregor's amendment and not putting time limits on these studies. That's why, Chair, at the very start of this meeting, at the very start of the meeting, I asked for clarification on that because the intent of the original Conservative motion was to limit the number of meetings. And given what I've just heard over the last week, in Estonia, we heard from the Director General of Police and Border Services and elected representatives. In Latvia, we heard from 3 experts on Russia and misinformation and disinformation. It's not just about the war. As I said, it's cognitive warfare that's being conducted by Russia. So I just want to stress that there's a lot more that we haven't heard or even thought about as a committee in terms of the Russia study that I think it's important to get in front of us. And with that, Chair, I've put my thoughts on the record. Thank you, Chair.
Great, thank you, Ms. Damoff. Ms. O'Connell is next on the speaking order.
Thanks. I'll pass to the next speaker, but ask to be added to the end again. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. O'Connell. The next speaker on the list is Mr. Lloyd. Does anyone know where Mr. Lloyd is? Okay, so we're going to go to the next speaker, who is Mr. Baker. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Chair, and thank you to you, Chair, and the colleagues for welcoming me here at the committee. I'm really, I thought it was really important that I have a chance to participate in the discussion today, especially today. So today is 1,000 days since Russia's further invasion of Ukraine, and it is many more days than Vladimir Putin thought it would take to conquer Ukraine. But it is 1,000 days too many, in my view. This should have never happened, and the world should have given Ukraine the help it needs to win this war a long time ago. That said, I think there's a number of reasons why that hasn't happened, why that assistance hasn't been there for the people of Ukraine. The assistance necessary for them to win. And I think a big part of why that assistance hasn't been there is because of what is being discussed at this very committee. And so, and specifically what I'm talking about is Russian interference, Russian misinformation and disinformation. And this affects Canadians, it affects Americans, it affects Europeans and people around the world, as the members of this committee well know. And it is impacting the decisions of key allied nations and the degree to which they support Ukraine and the ways in which they support Ukraine. As I've said before in the House, I know many colleagues have spoken to this in the House of Commons. The fight in Ukraine isn't just about the Ukrainian people. Supporting the Ukrainian people is the right thing to do, but it's also the right thing to do for Canada. And Ukraine's victory is really essential to Canada's security. Because if Russia wins, then they won't stop at Ukraine, and we know this because Vladimir Putin has said so. So if Russia wins, if Russia retains the approximately 25% of Ukraine that it holds today, that's a victory for Russia, and that means we're all under more threat. Canadians will be facing Russian aggression, whether it's in Europe with our NATO partners or in the Arctic or somewhere else around the world. And that's why, so coming back to the topic that we're discussing here at the committee, that's why I think that this subject of Russian misinformation, disinformation, the way it's being used to manipulate people, the way it's being used to influence governments around the world is at the core of what needs to be understood and researched to make sure that we win this war in Ukraine, that we help the Ukrainians win. I know that this committee has heard from a number of experts on this topic and witnesses. Some have been more forthcoming than others, I understand. But there's some folks who have done a lot of excellent work on the impact of Russian disinformation and what I was just talking about a moment ago. One of those people, one of those groups is an organization called Disinfo Watch. And some of you may know the folks involved with Disinfo Watch. Marcus Kolga is the one who I know best, but he has co-authored a study on this very issue, and I wanted to kind of share with you some of the findings from this. And again, the reason I'm sharing this is because I think this attempt to shorten the study of the component of the study on Russian interference is a very, very bad thing. I think when I talk to members, to a lot of Canadians, when I talk to people who support for Ukraine, when I talk to members of the Ukrainian Canadian community, they actually want us doing more studies, more investigation, raising a greater profile about the role of Russian misinformation and disinformation in Canada and around the world, not less. And so I think the attempt to shorten that or limit that aspect of the study is a dangerous thing. And so I'd like to share with you a few reasons as to why I feel that way. And I'm going to read from segments of a report by Disinfo Watch. So in spring 2024, Disinfo Watch and Canadian Digital Media Research Network conducted a survey of 2,127 Canadians to assess their exposure to several leading Kremlin narratives about Russia's war against Ukraine and to understand the vulnerability of Canadians to these narratives. And we found that a few things. One is most Canadians have been exposed to Russian foreign misinformation narratives, with 71% of Canadians having heard at least one of the narratives with an average exposure of 2.1 narratives. A substantial portion of Canadians exposed to Kremlin narratives believe them to be true or are unsure of their falsehood. For example, 70% of those exposed to the narrative about financial aid being misappropriated either believe it or are unsure. Well, let me just replay that. So 70% of Canadians who were surveyed by Disinfo Watch who were exposed to the narrative that that financial aid to Ukraine is being misappropriated, 70% of those people either believed it or were unsure whether it is true. So just think about what impact that has on Canadians as they think about whether Canada should be continuing to support the Ukrainian people. If 70% of them are thinking that maybe that aid is being misappropriated, and that's all coming through a criminal narrative. I continue to read. We found a marked difference in susceptibility to Russian disinformation along political lines. Conservative supporters who report the highest exposure levels to Kremlin narratives are also more likely to believe in them compared to their Liberal and NDP counterparts. For instance, only 55% of Conservatives exposed to the quote-unquote Ukrainian Nazis narrative believe it is false, compared to a higher rejection rate among other political groups. And I'll get into what I mean by that. This is a summary of some of their findings. Since Russia's initial invasion of Ukraine in 2014, the Kremlin has steadily intensified its information warfare, targeting Ukraine, NATO, and the Western democratic world, both inside and outside of Russia, using foreign information manipulation and interference. Over the past decade, the primary objectives of Russian foreign information manipulation and interference, and I'll just call that FIMI for short in the future. So the primary objectives of this by Russia and these influence and operations are to do a few things they have found. One is erode public support for Ukraine and NATO. The second is undermine unity among NATO allies. The third is discredit and intimidate governments, communities, journalists, and activists that are critical of the Kremlin. And the fourth is exploit existing divisions within democratic societies in order to undermine social cohesion and trust in our governments, media, and civil society. So let me just pause there for a second. So these four things that they've talked about, these are the objectives. This is what Russia is trying to do in Canada every day. Erode public support for Ukraine and NATO. Number two is undermine unity amongst NATO allies. So basically pit us against other NATO allies, and we've seen that play out in the world over the last number of years in a number of ways. Discredit and intimidate governments, communities, journalists, and activists that are critical of the Kremlin. I mean, there's many examples of this. I'll speak from the perspective of a member of the Ukrainian Canadian community, and I know many members of the Ukrainian Canadian community, especially leading members, those who are the sort of the strongest and most vocal advocates of support for Ukraine, who've talked about the fact that that they have been intimidated, or there's been attempts to intimidate them, because they've been critical of Putin or the Kremlin or Russia's invasion and further invasion of Ukraine. And we've seen that play out in a number of ways. And the fourth thing, exploit divisions within democratic societies in order to undermine social cohesion. So even if you step back and if you take a perspective away from the war in Ukraine and you're just focused more on domestic matters, even if that's just your focus and your priority, which is understandable for many folks, this is designed. Disinfowatch has concluded that this is designed to undermine our trust in each other, our willingness to work together, and to come to common understanding as to how we can work together to solve problems, no matter what those problems are, whether that's housing or the rise in the cost of living, or whether that's fighting climate change, or whether that's disinformation, just like we're discussing here today. Now, the Kremlin, I'm reading from the report, the Kremlin narratives that we tested are those that regularly feature on Russian state-controlled media platforms, like RT, Sputnik, and in statements by the Russian government officials and diplomats. And they include, number one, and this is in quotes, financial aid sent to Ukraine is being pocketed by corrupt officials within the Ukrainian government. Weapons we send to help Ukraine defend itself are just being sold on the black market instead, close quote. Open quote. Ukraine and NATO are the ones who started the war with Russia, close quote. Open quote. Russia is at war because it is trying to defend itself from Ukrainian Nazis, close quote. Open quote. Russia is going to win eventually, so sending aid to Ukraine is only delaying the inevitable, close quote. Open quote. Ukraine should give up their eastern territory for peace since the people living there are Russian anyway, close quote. We've all heard this stuff. Like, we've heard this, right? And we've heard it from the Kremlin and we've heard it from Putin. But what worries me is we are hearing it here in Canada because Kremlin disinformation and misinformation is so pervasive and so powerful and so sophisticated. So I continue to read from the report. Research has demonstrated that these narratives are amplified inside Western societies, including Canada, by regime-aligned influencers who may or may not receive benefit from doing so, targeting audiences on both ends of the political spectrum. The reach of these influencers on social media is not limited by borders. Canadian audiences are exposed to content posted by influencers in Canada, the U.S., and beyond. And I think that's one of the important things for us to take note of, right? Like, there's been a lot of discussion. I know this has been discussed here at this committee, but even publicly in the media about the indictment of folks related to tenant media and that sort of thing. And the focus has been, to a great extent, at least in the media coverage of it, about the impact this is having on how the information propelled by tenant media allegedly on behalf of the Kremlin, has been used to influence American audiences. But the reality is it's not just American audiences who consume the media that Tenet is putting out there. It's Canadians as well, probably in proportion to our population, in quantities proportional to our population. So it's affecting Canadians as well. And these are just the examples that we know of. Tenet is an example we know of, but there are undoubtedly many others. I continue to read from the report. Polling of Americans who identify as conservatives has demonstrated a likely vulnerability to Russian government narratives, which may correlate with a dramatic decrease in support for Ukraine among right-leaning Republican voters. A May 2024 Pew Research report about U.S. public support for Ukraine found a growing partisan gap between Republican and Democrat voters over the course of the war. Polling during the first months of the war found that get this is like really important, found that just 9% of Republican voters believed that the United States was providing too much aid to Ukraine, 9%. That number increased to 49% in April 2024. So it went from 9% to 49% in about 3 months, in a year, in over 2 years. In the same time frame, Democrats who believe that the U.S. is giving too much aid to Ukraine increased from 7% to 31%. The same Pew report also found that 55% of Republicans lacked confidence in President Zelensky, in contrast to 65% of Democrats who said they are confident in Ukraine's president. Similar trends have been observed in Canada. A February 2024 Angus Reid poll found that the number of Conservative voters who believe that Canada is giving too much to Ukraine doubled from 19% in May 2022 to 43%. While multiple domestic and geopolitical factors may have influenced these results, the impact of Russian information and influence operations on public opinion should also be considered. Our analysis aims to assess Canadian public vulnerabilities to each of the key Russian narratives above across the Canadian spectrum. So who is exposed? In March 2024, the Media Ecosystem Observatory, on behalf of the Canadian Digital Media Research Network, surveyed a nationally representative sample of Canadians, 2,127, about their exposure to 6 leading Kremlin foreign information manipulation interference narratives regarding Russia's war against Ukraine. If respondents had heard of these narratives, they were asked if they believed them to be true or not. Nearly half of those surveyed had heard the Kremlin's false claim that Russia is at war because it is trying to defend itself from Ukrainian Nazis, while only 26% of Canadians had heard the Russian narrative that falsely claims that weapons we send to Ukraine to defend itself are just being sold in the black market instead. So a disproportionately high number of Canadians who identified as Conservative Party voters, 54%, reported being exposed to the Kremlin narrative that falsely claims, quote, financial aid sent to Ukraine is being pocketed by corrupt officials within the Ukrainian government, close quote. Out of the 6 Kremlin narratives tested, Conservative Party voters reported the most exposure to 5 of them. And so the report has a chart, which I encourage all members to take a look at, which demonstrates to what extent Canadians are exposed to these different false narratives by the Kremlin. But it also shows it across party lines. So it shows to what degree Conservative, Liberal, and NDP supporters or voters have been exposed to these things. I go on from the report. The Kremlin has regularly accused Ukraine's government and people, as well as the Estonian, Latvian, and Lithuanian governments and people, of being neo-Nazis to justify its invasion of Ukraine in 2014 and its latest full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Vladimir Putin claimed in 2022 that he had ordered Russian forces to invade Ukraine to, quote, denazify the country. Ukraine's president is Jewish, and unlike Russia and many European nations, not a single far-right party holds a seat in Ukraine's parliament. So false claims about the presence of neo-Nazis in Ukraine have been repeated by Kremlin-aligned influencers in the democratic world, including Canada. For example, populist U.S. Congresswoman and conspiracy theorist Marjorie Taylor Greene has amplified this narrative to her millions of followers on social media. This narrative has been identified by both Eric Moyes, chair of the UN Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine and leading human rights legal scholar Yona Diamond, as an incitement to hate. 70% of Canadians exposed to this narrative, believe that it is either definitely or probably false. However, significantly fewer Canadians exposed to the narrative who identify as Conservatives believe this narrative is false, with just 55% rejecting this false Kremlin narrative. So just to recap here, and there's a chart here in the report, but the narrative, again, for those watching at home and are trying to follow along what I'm saying, the false narrative that Russia's put out there is that Russia is at war because it is trying to defend itself from Ukrainian Nazis. And so what the InfoWatch points out in its report is not only is to what degree people believe this statement is true or false. And so, for example, for Conservative voters, 25% believe it's true, 20% are unsure, and 55% believe it's false. With Liberals, it's 18% believe it's true, 12% are unsure, and 70% believe it's false. With NDP voters, it's 4% believe it's true, 9% unsure, and 87% believe it's false. So I think what you can take away from this is obviously this Russian these false narratives, this information is obviously being targeted at Canadians across the political spectrum, but it's having a greater effect with supporters of certain political parties than with others. In this particular case, it's believed to be true. The group of voters who believe it's most true are those who tend to vote Conservative. The Kremlin, I continue to read, the Kremlin and its allies have regularly blamed Ukraine and NATO for starting the war with Russia. This narrative is a central component of the Kremlin's information war against Russians, the Western world, and Ukraine. By portraying Ukraine as a puppet, in quotes, of NATO and alleging Western responsibility for the war, Russia seeks to frame its invasion as a defensive measure rather than an act of aggression. And this narrative aims to legitimize Russia's actions on the international stage and deflect blame. It also exploits existing anti-Western sentiments and skepticisms about NATO's role as a defensive alliance in Canada and other Western societies. And this narrative also aims to fracture alliance cohesion and unity. Inside of Russia, this narrative is deployed to bolster domestic support for the war by fostering a sense of external threat and nationalistic fervor. State-controlled media in Russia amplifies these themes, portraying the conflict as a struggle against Western encroachment and the defense of Russian-speaking populations. So, just as I mentioned earlier, they've got a chart where they outline, they repeat the narrative, the false narrative that the Kremlin is putting out there. Ukraine and NATO are the ones who started the war with Russia. And then they break down to what degree folks who support different political parties tend to believe this to be true or false. So in the case of, I'll start with the NDP this time, NDP voters, 72% believe it's false. With Liberal voters, 66% believe it's false. Among Conservative voters, only 38% believe it's false. So clearly this narrative, like the prior one, has had greater traction and is deemed more credible by Conservative voters. I continue to read. False narratives about Western support for Ukraine being misappropriated by Ukraine officials are deployed by the Kremlin to undermine support for Ukraine and weaken Western resolve. Both international and domestic audiences are targeted by this narrative. Internationally, the Kremlin seeks to erode trust and unity among countries providing aid to Ukraine. By casting doubt on the integrity of the Ukrainian government, Russia hopes to undermine the willingness of these countries to continue their financial and military support. It is intended to foster skepticism and hesitation among Western voters and policymakers, potentially leading to a reduction in aid. It exploits existing concerns about corruption in Ukraine, amplifying these worries to create a perception that assistance is futile and that it's being misused. Domestically, the narrative serves to justify Russia's actions and distract from its own endemic corruption. By portraying Ukraine as inherently corrupt, the Kremlin shifts the focus away from its own governance problems and frames the conflict as a moral crusade against a corrupt neighbor. This serves to consolidate support amongst Russians by reinforcing negative stereotypes about Ukraine and justifying the invasion as a necessary intervention. Ultimately, the Kremlin's goal is to weaken Ukraine's position by reducing international support, thereby making it more vulnerable and easier to influence or control. And I just want to stop there for a second. Like when we look, anybody who looks at Russia's governance, I mean, there are a few countries in the world that are more corrupt than Russia. Vladimir Putin has complete control of not just the political apparatus in Russia, but the judicial system, the media, and corruption. Anyone who's done business in Russia knows that corruption is rampant. So this point that the report's making about, accusing the Ukrainians of being corrupt and therefore Russia's and making it out as though Russia is therefore justified in invading Ukraine is actually taking attention away from Russia's corruption and control of everything by Vladimir Putin. So I'm reading from the report here. 70% of Canadians exposed to this narrative, the narrative that financial aid sent to Ukraine is being pocketed by corrupt officials within the Ukrainian government. 70% of Canadians exposed to this narrative either believe or are unsure if this narrative is false. That's significant. 70% of Canadians, indicating a significant failure to raise awareness of the facts about this issue. Over half of Conservative supporters believe this narrative to be true, compared to 29% of Liberal voters. Among the various Russian narratives included in this poll, this particular narrative was the second most believed among Conservative reporters. I continue to read from the report. According to the BBC, the Kremlin has created fake listings for the sale of Western weapons on dark websites to give the false impression that Western weapons being donated to Ukraine are being sold off on the black market by corrupt members of Ukraine's military. And there's no evidence of this. This narrative targets both international and domestic audiences, aiming to provoke doubt and reduce public support for Ukraine. Internationally, the Kremlin seeks to erode trust and solidarity among nations that are providing military assistance to Ukraine. By falsely claiming that weapons that are donated to Ukraine are being misused and sold illegally, Russia hopes to foster skepticism and hesitation among Western policymakers and citizens. The narrative exploits existing concerns about accountability and the potential for the proliferation of arms, and it aims to decrease the willingness of those countries to continue their support. One moment, please. What is it now? Yeah. So I'd now like to move that we adjourn the meeting.
There's a motion to adjourn the meeting or adjourn debate? Sorry, is it a motion to adjourn debate or adjourn the meeting?
The meeting.
The meeting. There's a motion to adjourn the meeting on the floor. Do we have unanimous consent? Okay, it looks like we have unanimous consent. Okay, meeting adjourned.